We've been talking about aspects of cognition that influence learning, and we've been focusing on what psychologists call cold cognition. Things like attention, executive function, judgments of learning, and source monitoring. Now, we're moving to what is sometimes called more hot cognition, and that's how emotions and motivations change the way we learn. In this lecture, I'll be talking about the role of emotion in learning. Now, in the first lecture, one of the myths I mentioned was the idea that emotion interferes with learning. So here I want to ask specifically, how does it affect learning when we feel happy or sad? Now, emotions are a tricky topic, and that's because we talk about emotions a lot in our everyday lives. So we need to start by outlining what it means when psychologists study emotions. Now, emotions are defined as a temporary state of the person that involves coordinated patterns of physiological arousal and mental states that can promote emotionally relevant patterns of behavior. Now let's unpack this definition. One mnemonic device people use for this is the ABC device. A is for arousal. Emotions involve arousal patterns, either increased or decreased arousal, depending on the emotion. B is for behavior. Emotions are linked to specific behaviors, and this includes characteristic facial expressions like smiling and frowning, and also other kinds of behavior like approaching or avoiding a person. C is for cognition, and this reminds us that emotions involve particular mental states, feelings, goals, and thoughts. So happiness is a temporary state that's associated with calm physiology, low arousal, a positive mental state, positive feelings, the belief that good things have happened and that the current situation is one we want to keep going. And it's associated with behaviors like smiles, expressing positive statements, and of course it's generally something we like to feel. By contrast, anger is a state associated with strong physiological arousal, a racing heartbeat, and increased blood pressure. It entails an aversive feeling, something we don't like, along with thoughts that we've been thwarted or threatened or had another person get in the way of what we want. It's associated with furrowed brows and narrowed mouth expressions, flared nostrils, and behaviors like yelling or even physical aggression. Now, these features of emotion, the ABCs, go together. And in fact, you can actually get people to experience the physiology of a particular emotion, sometimes even to feel the subjective emotional state, by getting them to pose their face in the right expression. For example, one absolutely hilarious research project involved getting people to make facial expressions with instructions that never give away what emotion they're actually posing. So I might give you instructions like, lift up your eyebrows a bit, crinkle your nose, and note, I didn't tell you what face you're starting to make with this method. And then the researchers looked at people's physiological arousal patterns while they were making that face, and they looked at what emotions people reported feeling. So it turned out that people's physiological responses matched the emotion they were, unknown to them, posing. And some participants even reported feeling the target emotional state. If you're curious, I was describing pieces of the disgust expression. Many researchers believe that emotions have an evolutionary basis, based in part on work by Gottman and Levinson, and this is actually important to consider as we think about how emotions might affect learning. Negative emotions are triggered by threatening situations. Situations in which we've lost something or may lose something trigger sadness and anxiety, and if there's a responsible party, if there's someone to blame, they can trigger anger. Anger and anxiety in particular tend to rev the body up for fight or flight responding. And theorists believe that anger and fear served to actually motivate fight or flight in our evolutionary history. So it's also not surprising that we share these basic emotions with many other animals. Rats, for example, demonstrate anxiety, dogs easily show depression, and every cat I've ever owned was excellent at displays of anger. Now, happiness and pleasure and joy, on the other hand, they're a bit less obviously functional. Now, I don't want you to get me wrong, I really like positive emotions. It's just not totally clear if they serve a strong evolutionary function, and this is a kind of mystery that we'll return to later in this lecture. But let's start with negative emotions. What do negative emotions do to the learning process? Now, if we want to investigate this question, we can do at least two different things. So one thing we can do is we can look at how well people learn positive versus negative stimuli. So we can assume that any differences observed in that learning are reflecting the effects of the emotions that are associated with the stimuli. A second thing we can do is we can actually induce negative emotions in people, and then we can look at how well they learn. Now, to do this second thing, we have to first be able to create emotional states in people in an experimental setting. And the ability to do this, to induce emotion in the laboratory, is what permits researchers to actually test the impact of emotional states on learning. Researchers induce emotion in a variety of ways. They might ask people to recall autobiographical experiences that involved particular emotions, and they might also show people film clips or images or musical selections that seem to induce particular emotions in people. And many researchers have settled on film clips and images because these materials let us expose everyone to the same event or experience in order to make them, for example, fearful. Now, by contrast, if we actually use our own experiences, if I ask you to recall a time when you were afraid, it means that you might think about failing to make an important customer contact in your company. If I were a participant, I might think about screwing up a lecture, and my 5-year-old might think about the idea that ghosts are real and coming to get her. Now, another issue is that we have to consider whether we're going to assume that all negative emotions are the same in their impact on learning, or whether we think different negative emotions might have distinctive effects. So let's consider this a little more closely. On the one hand, negative emotions like anger, fear, and sadness have a lot in common. We don't like to feel those feelings. We often seek to do something to get rid of those feelings. So what these feelings share is what researchers call a valence, a position on the dimension that goes from things we like to feel to things we don't like feeling, and they're on the negative side. But they're different in terms of the kind of arousal they involve. Fear and anger, for example, involve high levels of physiological arousal, and sadness doesn't do that. It doesn't involve such high arousal in general. And finally, there's even more distinctness in terms of what these emotions may get us ready to do. Fear is connected to flight, anger is connected to fighting, and sadness possibly is connected to resting and or seeking social support from other people. So when we think about how negative emotions affect learning, we'll need to consider what they have in common, that negative valence, and we also need to think about where they're distinct in their arousal and in the specific kinds of actions that they're going to promote. So first, let me give you a general claim. Negative emotions appear to narrow our attentional focus so that we're better at learning details about an emotionally negative stimulus. So let's consider some of the evidence for this. In some of the earliest studies, you might be asked to learn a series of images from slides, and most of the slides would be neutral. You'd sit there watching along while one slide after another comes into view, and then suddenly you would see a really awful slide, a scene of carnage, and then back to the more standard sort of neutral slides. Now, later, to test whether you've learned the images, researchers might ask you which slides you were shown before, and they would give you a mix of slides that you did see and slides that you didn't see. So it's a recognition test. Normally, when we see a list of items and we're later asked to remember them, we show a tendency to better learn and remember the initial items in the list and the last items in the list. And we're not so great with the middle items. Well, putting that awful slide in the middle really changes things up. And you're probably not surprised to find that you're very likely to learn the awful slide and remember it later. Now, interestingly, you were remarkably unlikely to remember the slide immediately before or immediately after that traumatic slide. And researchers view this as an adaptive attention and learning phenomenon. Things that don't matter much are okay to learn if there's nothing more serious going on around us, but if something is really threatening, that's the thing to pay attention to and remember, and you don't want to waste any resources on the kind of neutral stuff that came around it. So Elizabeth Kensinger took this strategy of looking at learning lists of negative versus neutral images a little bit further. And in her studies, negative images might be things like snakes, and neutral images might be things like a tea kettle. So she showed people a set of images, and then she asked them to look at a second set of images using a memory test to evaluate their learning of the first set. Now, in this second set, some objects were identical to those in the learned set, others were similar, and some were new. And people had to judge whether the new images were identical, which requires memory for little details. For example, you have to remember that the snake was a green python and not a rattlesnake. Or similar, and the similar judgment just requires memory that you saw an image of a snake. So it turns out people's memory for details was significantly better for negative images. Now, later, Kensinger and her colleagues showed that negative stimuli don't just get better learned in general. We actually learn the important and central details of negative things. And in fact, we're more likely to forget the peripheral and less important details of those things. For example, if you see a picture of a snake on the riverbank versus seeing a picture of a string on the riverbank, you learn what the snake looks like very well, but you don't really learn what the riverbank looks like nearly as well. Well, okay, this all seems good, and this is consistent with the idea that negative emotions narrow attention for important things and help learning for the important stuff. But you might say, it's not really the same as feeling negative and trying to learn. This is really about learning emotionally negative stuff, and that's just not quite the same thing. And you might also be thinking, well, snakes and skulls and other pictures, that seems really like it's about fear, not negative emotions in general. So what happens if you make people feel negative emotions and then you ask them to learn things that are more or less neutral? Well, one study in this area made people feel either sad or happy, and then asked them to learn to solve some Tower of Hanoi problems. Now, you remember the Tower of Hanoi. That's the task with the discs and the platforms, and the challenge is to arrange the discs without putting larger discs on smaller ones or trying to put them on the table, and so on. Now, we mentioned it in the lecture about executive function. What can be learned in this task is a procedure for breaking the problem down into smaller parts that are easier to handle correctly. Well, once in their mood, participants were asked to do additional problems to see whether their learning transferred to similar problems, like a more complicated tower task, and also to related but less obviously similar problems. Now, participants who were in a negative mood, who were sad when they learned, required more trials in the Tower of Hanoi task to learn, and they did more poorly overall. Participants who were in a negative mood when they tried to generalize their learning to new tasks, they needed more time to do the transfer tasks, and their ability to generalize their learning was also less good than for participants who were in a happy mood. So far it looks like fear might enhance learning of threat-relevant information, and sadness might just suppress learning performance. It's less clear what anger does, but it seems likely that it'll operate a little bit like fear in that it is likely to narrow attention towards relevant central details. In this case, maybe the face and actions of the person that made you angry. Now, a broad sweep of the findings in this area actually seems to confirm those kinds of broad conclusions. So, importantly though, although some negative emotions help us focus attention and improve our learning of critical and threat-relevant details in the moment, other studies have shown that over the long term, negative emotions in academic contexts like college are actually connected to lower student involvement, to lower student motivation, to students being less likely to use effective learning strategies like elaborative encoding, and ultimately, they're connected to students learning less well, as indicated by their academic performance. Well, this may seem like a bunch of contradictory findings, but they actually make a fair amount of sense in the context of evolutionary work. Negative emotions do seem to narrow attention, and they focus it on information that's most relevant to an immediate threat, so they enhance learning of the most important information for that person at that moment. But they suppress learning of less relevant information. Now then, when there's no immediate threat, negative emotions appear to generally suppress a bunch of things that we know promote better learning, and ultimately they have a negative impact on learning itself. So remember, negative emotions mess up learning of unrelated material. Okay, well that's negative emotions. But remember earlier I told you there's this kind of mystery about positive emotion and what good positive emotions are anyway? Well, Barb Fredrickson, a social psychologist at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, she was quite taken with this issue. So first of all, positive emotions don't really involve physiological arousal. Rather, they're actually characterized by kind of a lack of stress-related arousal. And second, what actions could positive emotions really promote anyway? I mean, sort of sitting around, sort of like the saying goes, fat, dumb, and happy? Given their association with lower levels of arousal, Fredrickson first thought maybe positive emotions help us speed recovery from negative emotional arousal, and they do. Actually, being encouraged to experience positive emotions after you've experienced some negative ones speeds up your return to a baseline neutral level of physical arousal. But Fredrickson thought there might also be more to the story. In looking at a variety of research findings on creativity, broad thinking, and even on artistic temperaments, Fredrickson settled on a larger idea about positive emotions. And it's the idea that their function is to support us in broadening and building. That is, positive feelings support us in acquiring resources for the long term, whereas negative emotions support immediate, focused action in response to important, current threats. Now, the resources positive emotions orient us to acquire might take a lot of forms. So, for example, positive emotion encourages us to connect with other people, to establish new social relationships, and actually to affirm existing social relationships. Positive emotion also supports us in exploring our environment. And in fact, earlier in this class, we talked about the very basic inclination animals and humans have to explore the environment. So rats explore right away when they're placed into new environments, and people also do this. But here's the kicker. This kind of exploration really only happens for rats that are feeling pretty good, rats that are feeling safe and secure and happy. If a rat is feeling fearful, for example, it doesn't explore a new space. Likewise, attachment theory in developmental psychology was based on the idea that babies need a secure relationship to their parents in order to explore the environment. Babies who haven't got that secure relationship are less likely to explore, and babies who are afraid don't explore either. And exploration is fundamental to learning. Now, one way to articulate this idea in a more succinct way is to propose that positive emotions broaden our focus of attention and broaden what we can learn. So how to test this idea stringently in the laboratory? In order to do so, you need to be able to make people feel positive emotions, and you need a way to examine whether our focus of attention is broad or narrow. Now, there's some other important issues as well. You need to compare positive emotions to a neutral state, and you need to show that different positive emotions, like amusement and contentment, all work similarly to broaden attention. So how can we do this? Well, to make people feel positive, one strategy is to use brief 2 to 3 minute film clips. And so film clips of penguins at play, for example, are used by Fredrickson and her colleagues to create feelings of amusement, and scenes of nature are used to create serenity and contentment. To create neutral states, films that look like random pattern screensavers can be used. Now, to examine whether participants had a broader attentional focus after the positive emotion film clips, Fredrickson and colleagues used a task that assesses a preference for global or general versus local, detail-oriented, processing of visual images. Now, some tests of global and local processing use a letter naming task. So you might look at a capital letter B that is made up entirely of smaller letter A's. And if you're using global processing to name the letters, you should say that you're looking at a B. And if you're using local processing, you'll say the letter you're seeing is a bunch of little a's. Now, Fredrickson and colleagues, they wanted to look at a slightly different task because they wanted a task where there wasn't a single right answer and where participants' answers would give a preference for either looking at details or for looking at the big picture. So they chose one that uses geometric shapes, and it has a logic a little bit like that letter task. So in this case, you look at an image and it shows you a larger shape that's made up of smaller shapes. For example, you might see 3 small triangles arranged on the page in a triangular pattern. So here there's no conflict between global and local processing. It's all triangles. You're either looking at one big triangle or you're looking at 3 small triangles. Then you see 2 additional figures. One figure is composed of a big triangle that's made out of 3 small squares. And the other figure is 4 small triangles that are placed in a square pattern. And participants are asked to judge which of the new figures is the most like the one they started out looking at. Now, people whose attention is globally focused are going to use the general shape of the big figure. They're focused on the big picture. And what they'll do is they'll choose the triangular array of squares because that looks like a big triangle. Those whose attention is detail focused will choose the 4 triangles because they were looking at the smaller figures that were making up the big picture. Now, both answers are correct in a way, but they reflect a preference for looking at the big picture or for looking at the details. And so again, if you look at the big picture, you choose the triangular array of little squares because you think the big triangle is what you're matching. And if you look at the details, you do the opposite. You're trying to match the smaller individual triangles from the previous image. Now, people in this study first viewed an emotion-inducing film clip, penguins, nature, screensaver, and then they responded to that global local task. And the task had 8 items. People got 1 point for each global response they made. So the more points you get, the more globally focused your attention is. Now, participants in the 2 positive emotion conditions chose significantly more global responses than people in that neutral condition. And they averaged about 5 to 6 global choices out of 8 possible points that they could have gotten. And it really didn't matter whether they were amused or contented. Now, as you know, attention is not the same as learning, but having this broader attentional focus might increase the amount of information people are able to take in contrast to the effects of negative emotions, if you consider previous lectures on the role of attention. And we've also thought here and there about the importance of wanting to learn. This is a topic we'll go into more detail on in the next lecture. But not surprisingly, positive emotions may help to maintain our motivation to learn. Now, Reschly and colleagues, for example, looked at positive emotion and academic engagement in a sample of high school students. And students who reported feeling positive emotions a lot in school also reported higher levels of engagement with learning. Now, Reschly and colleagues didn't have assessments of whether students were actually learning more effectively. But in the study I mentioned earlier that showed negative effects of negative emotion on students' learning, the researchers also did look at positive emotion. And over the course of a semester, they were able to show that students who report lots of positive emotions in the context of classes ended up using better learning strategies, being more intrinsically motivated by school, and ultimately doing better. And in this case, it was based on their actual academic achievement, their test scores, and their end-of-term grades. Now, there are some problems with interpreting this work as definitively showing that emotions cause changes in learning, because students with more positive emotion may have been more capable, more knowledgeable, or better prepared to begin with. So the emotions themselves might not have played a role in their better learning outcomes. A more recent study in this arena actually took an experimental approach, one where the experimenters actually control who's feeling what emotions, and they're able to rule out prior differences in knowledge as a result. And this study actually focused on category learning. Ruby Nadler and her colleagues used music and video clips like A Laughing Baby and excerpts from Schindler's List to see how emotions might influence learning of complex categories that in some cases were rule-based and in some cases were not rule-based. So people were assigned to positive, neutral, or negative emotion conditions, and they first heard music related to their mood condition, and then they watched film clips. The film clips for the negative condition were sadness related, and the ones for the positive condition were often amusing. And after this, the researchers asked participants to report their emotional states to make sure that they really got the happy condition folks feeling happy and the sad condition folks feeling sad. Now, people then learned a categorization task that involves something called a Gabor patch, and it looks a lot like a wrinkled patch of a surface, and the wrinkles can vary in how many they are and which way they're oriented. And in the Nadler study, the category task was of 2 types. So sometimes it was a rule-based category where people could explain the rule for classifying a visual image of the Gabor patch and using words. And in the other cases, it was a non-rule described category. So the category was complex, and they couldn't really articulate a rule verbally, even though they were able to learn the task and categorize things pretty well. Now, as it turns out, being in a good mood enhanced people's ability to learn the categories correctly when they were rule-based, but not when the category system was that more complex, intuitively acquired one. And the researchers argued that positive moods are going to be most helpful when people are using that explicit System 2 kind of learning approach. The kind of learning approach we use, you might remember, for categories where we can describe them with rules. When you need to use System 1 for categories that aren't easily described by rules, it looks like mood may matter less. And that makes sense, because attention, in the way we've discussed it, is more critical for System 2 kinds of learning. System 1 learning is going on under the surface, and it has less to do with that conscious focus of attention. Now, having said this, so far, good moods sound really good. Broader attention, better category learning, better long-term academic learning. And there's more. Transfer of learning is a particularly important issue. As we've seen, transfer isn't always so optimal. We can't always take what we've learned in one setting and apply it in some other situation or to another task. And it could be that the more creative, attentionally broad cognitive approach that people in a good mood have is specifically good at enhancing transfer. And indeed, that's also what happens in research that investigates this issue. So people who learn a task do better at transferring that knowledge to similar problems when they're in a good mood. In summarizing where we've been today, it's clear that emotions influence learning at many phases of the process. They influence the breadth or narrowness of attention, the extent to which we actively seek information, and the way we approach the information that we do get. Emotions appear to affect the speed with which we learn, and they also affect our ability to generalize what we're learning, to apply learned rules or approaches in new circumstances or new problems. Now, one way to think about this in practical applications is that some moods are better for some tasks. A relatively negative mood is optimal for situations where we need to be focused on specific material and we need to learn central aspects of that material. And the way I think about this is that some mild anxiety in studying for a test might actually lead to better performance because it helps us to focus attention and it helps ensure that we study enough and that we study the central stuff. And this is especially true if we're not chronically anxious, but we're only anxious when we actually need to be a little bit anxious to get our studying focus underway. A relatively positive mood, by contrast, may be more useful for taking in new scenes, getting an overall feel for a new place with that global focus of attention, creatively using past learning in the service of solving new problems, and other cases where the point of learning isn't to address a current looming threat like an exam, but rather to build knowledge and resources for the longer term. For listening to today's lecture, for example, positive moods are probably better. And while we don't all have the standardized emotion-inducing video clips researchers use in controlled experiments, the study of category learning mentioned earlier actually pulled clips from YouTube. And the lead author speculated that viewing occasional funny videos at work might actually enhance employees' productivity and maybe creativity. As will probably not surprise you, emotions are intricately tied to what we want. We feel good things when we get what we want and bad things when our goals are threatened. And next lecture, we'll actually consider the issue of what we want in more detail and how what we want influences what we learn.